Exodus is just good stuff all over. So I know nobody's complaining. Trust me. Nobody's complaining.
Yeah, it is good stuff. There's just a lot in here, and I don't want to, sound like a broken record here, but there's just a lot in here that's easy to read over. That really,
Guilty.
boy, I never really thought about that before, or never really factored that into something else, that might be more familiar. We hit that last time, just in chapter 16, but here we go again. We're going to have the same issue here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to read the whole chapter. And since I've already telegraphed, this is going to be broken into two parts. The first part where we're going to camp today is the first 7 verses, the water from the rock episode. And, I really toyed about doing the whole chapter. And I thought, if I do that, we're going to have to split it up anyway, because 8 through 16, Exodus 17, verse 8 through the end of the chapter, is the Amalekite Incident, and that's going to take us into some real unseen realm territory, but actually to a depth and adding content elements that I did not cover in the book. So that's going to be sort of one of those expanding episodes where we expand on certain things in the book. So I just figured, we're going to have to do it anyway. We're going to take that off. We're going to make it its own episode, but I'm going to read through the whole chapter just so that you can get what we're doing today, and then you get a preview of what part 2 is going to be about. And by the time we wrap up today, I'll also sort of telegraph a bit more of what part 2 is going to be about. And some of you might, even as we read through it right now, will sort of pick up on it. But for those who don't, I'll telegraph it. It's going to be good stuff. So here we are, Exodus 17. I'm again reading from ESV. All the congregation of the people of Israel moved on from the wilderness of sin by stages, according to the commandment of the Lord, and camped at Refidim. But there was no water for the people to drink. Therefore the people quarreled with Moses and said, "Give us water to drink." And Moses said to them, "Why do you quarrel with me? Why do you test the Lord?" But the people thirsted there for water, and the people grumbled against Moses and said, "Why did you bring us up out of Egypt to kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst?" So Moses cried to the Lord, "What shall I do with this people? They are almost ready to stone me." And the Lord said to Moses, "Pass on before the people, taking with you some of the elders of Israel, and take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile, and go. Behold, I will stand before you there on the rock at Horeb. And you shall strike the rock, and water shall come out of it, and the people will drink." And Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel. And he called the name of the place Massah and Meribah, because of the quarreling of the people of Israel, because they tested the Lord by saying, "Is the Lord among us or not?" Let me just stop there. We hit a few things. There was a reference to the elders of Israel, and you say, well, that's kind of weird because we're only going to get the elders in the next chapter. That's true, but we've already seen, Exodus doesn't follow strict chronology. It was composed at different times. We also got a reference to Horeb, which we saw earlier in our episodes on the location of Mount Sinai. That's another name for Sinai. We're going to get into that big time here. That's really what our focus this episode, this part of Exodus 17 is going to be. But if we keep reading, here's what we get. This is verse 8 now, to the end of the chapter. Then Amalek came and fought with Israel at Refidim. So Moses said to Joshua, "Choose for us men and go out and fight with Amalek. Tomorrow I will stand on the top of the hill with the staff of God in my hand." So Joshua did as Moses told him and fought with Amalek, while Moses, Aaron, and Hur went up to the top of the hill. Whenever Moses held up his hand, Israel prevailed, and whenever he lowered his hand, Amalek prevailed. But Moses' hands grew weary, so they took a stone and put it under him, and he sat on it, while Aaron and Hur held up his hands, one on one side and the other on the other side. So his hands were steady until the going down of the sun. And Joshua overwhelmed Amalek and his people with the sword. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Write this as a memorial in a book and recite it in the ears of Joshua, that I will utterly blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven." And Moses built an altar and called the name of it, "The Lord is my banner," saying, "A hand upon the throne of the Lord. The Lord will have war with Amalek from generation to generation." Now that's the end of the chapter. And again, I don't want to telegraph too much now because I'm going to do that at the end of this episode. But the reference to Amalek is really, important. It's going to take us down a number of roads here, and some of the language used elsewhere in this section. Now, the part about Moses raising his hands, if you remember the episode that we did about Elim and the terebinths there, the 12 and the 70 and all that imagery, we alluded to this episode about, well, maybe the staff of Moses, since it's wood, it came from a tree, is emblematic of the tree of God, or divine encounter, maybe even Eden, because there's a reason why trees were put at places of divine encounter, or divine encounter occurred at places where there were trees, because of the cosmic garden, the cosmic mountain imagery that takes our minds back to Eden. So we talked about that a little bit. I'm not going to spend much time on that next week. I'm going to spend most of the time, really practically all the time, on the issue of who is Amalek and how that bleeds into some other passages. But when we get to the end of this episode, I'll telegraph that a little bit more. So for our purposes here, we want to get into the first 7 verses. And the first thing we sort of run into here, it doesn't sound like much. I mean, this is easy sermonic material, trust God, so on and so forth, and all that's true. And it would be good sermonic material. But the reference to Refidim and Meribah and Massah are actually really important. They're going to dovetail with some things that we've talked about earlier. So Refidim, I'm going to read you a little bit from the Anchor Bible Dictionary on Refidim. And I think that'll, sort of, again, telegraph for us what we're going to be talking about. So the entry in ABD, Anchor Bible Dictionary, says this: Refidim, a station of the Exodus located between the wilderness of Sin and the wilderness of Sinai, according to Exodus 17, 1 and 8, Exodus 19, 2, and Numbers 33, 14, and 15. So let me just read Exodus 19, 2, just so that you have that in your head. They set out from Rephidim and came into the wilderness of Sinai, and they encamped in the wilderness. There Israel encamped before the mountain. In Numbers 13, 14, and 15, they set out from Alush and camped at Rephidim, where there was no water for the people to drink. And they set out from Rephidim and camped in the wilderness of Sinai. So you get the impression that Rephidim and Sinai are somewhat close. We don't have measurements or anything like that in here, but we kind of get that impression. Let me back to ABD. The next sentence says, Dofka and Alush are also mentioned as encampments between the wilderness of Sin and Rephidim. The location of Rephidim is unknown and dependent upon the identification of Mount Sinai. Various proposals have been made following a northern route of the Exodus, placing Mount Sinai and thus Rephidim in the Negev highlands, the North Sinai, or the land of Midian. Those opting for a southern Exodus route locate Rephidim in the vicinity of Jebel Musa, close to the southern tip of the peninsula. Now, let me just stop there. In Jebel Musa, that's the traditional site of Sinai, way down in the V, that's formed between the two forks of the Red Sea. And the other ones are, of course, further north, a variety of situations. But the key point at this point is to note that Rephidim, again, has some proximity to Sinai, to Mount Sinai. Now, 3 significant events occur while Israel is situated at Rephidim. The Israelites complain of being in a place where, quote, there was no water for the people to drink, unquote. So Moses is instructed to provide water by smiting the rock. Rephidim became known as Massah, which means testing, and Meribah, which means contention, because Israel determined to test the Lord to see if he was among them or not. Again, we just read that. The term Massah is used several other times in warnings to Israel not to prove or test the Lord as they did at Rephidim. And those references would include Deuteronomy 6:16, Deuteronomy 9:22, and we've got Deuteronomy 33:8. So basically just don't do this like you did at, Rephidim. Now here is an important component. Meribah, that term that we just read in Exodus 17 that's associated with Rephidim, the incident at Rephidim. Meribah also refers to an incident near Kadesh Barnea, involving a challenge to Moses to provide water. Okay, that's Numbers 20, verse 13, Numbers 20, 24, Numbers 27, 14, Deuteronomy 32, 51, and Psalm 81, 7. And we also get Meribah mentioned in Deuteronomy 33, 1 and 2. I'm going to turn there in a second. But again, here's what you need to be tracking on. Refidim, there's some proximity between Refidim and Mount Sinai. Okay? There's also some proximity between Refidim and Kadesh. Okay? Again, these I should just read a couple numbers. Which ones do I want to go to here? Well, you know what? I'm going to hold off because I'll get into a fuller discussion here about the Kadesh specifically. Let's go to Deuteronomy 33, 1 and 2. Here's where else, but this isn't going to be as obvious in translation where else this occurs. So Deuteronomy 33. I'm going to start with ESV, and here's what it says. I actually did discuss this passage in Unseen Realm in the section about divine counsel presence at the giving of the law. Okay, so here's Deuteronomy 33, verse 1. This is the blessing with which Moses, the man of God, blessed the people of Israel before his death. He said, "The Lord came from Sinai and dawned from Seir upon us. He shone forth from Mount Paran." Let me stop there. Now here we're back in the march from the south passages. And earlier when we talked about the location of Sinai, I said you must account for the march from the south, and it's part of how to locate Sinai, and it's actually significant trouble for the view that Sinai is in Midian. Okay, if you can go back and listen to those episodes, but here we are again. This is one of those passages. The Lord came from Sinai and dawned from Seir upon us. He shone forth from Mount Paran. Here's the next line. He came from the 10,000s of holy ones with flaming fire at his hand, which is really odd. That's ESV. Yes, he loved his people, verse 3. All his holy ones were in his hand. That's also really odd. So they followed in your footsteps, receiving direction from you. Now, if you read Unseen Realm, you will know that there are a number of textual issues in Deuteronomy 33. And I took people to the Septuagint and compared the Masoretic text, the traditional text, with the Septuagint. Because this passage is really behind the New Testament idea, which is stated in 3 or 4 passages about the law being dispensed or delivered through or by angels. Okay? And it's not really clear in ESV because ESV is following the Masoretic text, basically. Septuagint, it gets a little clearer, and I'll turn there in a second. But if I switch versions here and go to the Tanakh, this is the Jewish Publication Society English translation of the same passage, Deuteronomy 33. This is what it says. It translates the Masoretic text a little bit differently than ESV does. This is the blessing with which Moses, the man of God, bade the Israelites farewell before he died. He said, "The Lord came from Sinai. He shone upon them from Seir. He appeared from Mount Paran and approached from Rivavot Kodesh." It transliterates that term. Doesn't translate it, it transliterates it. Lightning flashing at them from his right. Lover indeed of the people, their hallowed something are all in your hand. Again, that's awkward too. They followed in your steps, accepting your pronouncements. Now, the Hebrew text reads, either translated from Ribabot Kodesh or going back to the ESV, where it says, from the 10,000s of holy ones. The Hebrew text actually says Meribah Kodesh. Meribah, Meribot. Meribot is the construct form. If you've had a little Hebrew, you know that the AH ending of a feminine noun, and geographical nouns are typically feminine, changes to a T when it's linked to a following noun. So Meribot Kadesh is the word Meribah, which is associated with Refidim in Exodus 17, followed by the place name Kadesh. It's really kind of odd, and you can see, again, why there's a problem. Now, if you go to the Masoretic text, the Kadesh part is pointed, the vowels put in it are pointed to spell Kodesh, which is like holy or holiness or something like that. But the Septuagint, and I'm going to click over to Unseen Realm here because I discussed this in Unseen Realm. The translator of Unseen Realm didn't take those consonants that way. Or excuse me, the translator of the Septuagint that I refer to in Unseen Realm did not take the consonants that way. I'm going to click out to Unseen Realm. This is on page 164. That's where it begins. And this is part of the discussion of the law being dispensed by angels and whatnot. And I put Deuteronomy 33, 1 through 4 into two columns. The left column was the traditional Masoretic text, and the right column is the Septuagint. Here's what the Septuagint says. The Lord has come from Sinai, and he appeared to us from Seir. He made haste from Mount Paran with 10,000s of, or from Kadesh, Kadesh, the place name. At his right hand, his angels with him. And in Unseen Realm, I talked about how the Septuagint, since it has angels with him at Kadesh, which is also right there in the verse, it's connected with Sinai, how the Septuagint is really kind of the pool from which Paul in Galatians and the writer of Hebrews and some other passages in the New Testament where they get this idea, this connection between the law being delivered and having an angelic presence there. And this is a very clear New Testament idea. And so the question I'm addressing in Unseen Realm at this point is, where does the idea come from? And, you can go back and look at the discussion there. If you wanted to look at the New Testament references, you'd go to Acts 7, 52 and 53, and Hebrews 2, 1 and 2, Galatians 3, 19. Again, this is a very clear New Testament idea that the law was delivered or dispensed by or, somehow mediated by or in some way connected with the event of the giving of the law. There's angels, there's a divine council presence. Okay, you can go back and read that. But what I want you to notice here is that there were some translations, namely the Septuagint, that took the Hebrew and saw a place name there, Kadesh. And if you looked again at the Hebrew, underlying that, you could see how they could do that with the vowels. You could also see prior to that the word Meribah in construct, to use Hebrew grammar lingo, Meribat Kadesh. So Deuteronomy 33, these first few verses, which are clearly associated with Sinai, this is Yahweh coming from the south. The Lord came from Sinai. Dawn from Seir, connects Sinai and Seir and Mount Paran, and now Kadesh. Okay, just hold that in your lap for a little bit, because what we're going to establish here, or at least illustrate, is that Refidim, which is the passage in the first 7 verses of Exodus that we just read, where this incident with the water of the rock comes from, it is associated geographically. It has proximity to Mount Sinai, which would make sense given Deuteronomy 33, and again with the way the Septuagint translator took the text, and other passages as well. So we have Refidim and Sinai being part of the same regional context. And if Refidim is part of that context, and Sinai and Kadesh, well, so are Meribah and Massah. Again, so we've got a number of place names here that are all, again, part of the same regional context. And this is actually going to produce another problem for Mount Sinai being at Midian, because Kadesh is known. The location there is known. And so are Seir and Paran. These places are known, just the area, at least generally. And so we're right back, into that topic that we had discussed, weeks ago about the location of Sinai. And here we have Exodus 17 contributing to the problem. Now I'm going to go to Anchor Bible Dictionary again, and this is the entry on Massah and Meribah. It has those two places have their own entry. It says this: literally, the terms mean testing and strife. This is the site of an Israelite rebellion during the desert wandering, Exodus 17:7. The precise location is unknown, since the Elohist, again, Anchor Bible Dictionary has taken the JEDP view of the Torah, since one, places it at Horeb and near Refidim in Exodus 17. Both of those, again, are equally unknown locations. So Horeb, again, is Sinai. Nobody knows how do you determine exactly where Sinai is. Again, nobody knows that. Refidim is the same place, same incident. And so Massah and Meribah, again, are part of this whole discussion. Now, they give some cross-references here, and I'm going to read these to you. Numbers 20, verses 13 and 14. Just listen to what these passages say. This is about Edom, okay? Moses sent messengers from Kadesh to the king of Edom. Now, right away, that implies that the two places aren't precisely the same, but they're regionally they're close. There's again they're in the same area, same region. We're talking regionally here. Moses sent messengers from Kadesh to the king of Edom, and Edom, of course, is associated with Seir and Mount Paran, and those places are in turn connected with Sinai. All right, Mount Sinai. This is the March from the South tradition. If you haven't listened to those early episodes, you need to. So he sent messengers from Kadesh to the king of Edom. Thus says your brother Israel, you know all the hardship that we have met, how our fathers went down to Egypt, and we lived in Egypt a long time. And the Egyptians dealt harshly with us and our fathers. And when we cried to the Lord, he heard our voice and sent an angel. Isn't that interesting? And brought us out of Egypt. And here we are in Kadesh, a city on the edge of your territory. So again, there's that indication that there's geographical proximity here. Please let us pass through your land, so on and so forth. And of course, then they have a problem. Edom says, no, I'm not going to let you do that. And then there's a conflict there, or at least, it's not a good relationship. Edom refuses. Israel turned away because, again, there's a relationship there. And so God says, okay, But again, it establishes an adversarial relationship between Edom and Israel. But for our purposes here, the point is that we've got some geographical regional connections between these place names. Numbers 27:14. I'm going to go back up to verse 12. The Lord said to Moses, go up into this mountain of Avarim and see the land that I have given to the people of Israel. When you have seen it, you also shall be gathered to your people, as your brother Aaron was. So this is right before Moses dies. Because you rebelled against my word in the wilderness of Zin, when the congregation quarreled, failing to uphold me as holy at the waters before their eyes. These are the waters of Meribah of Kadesh in the wilderness of Zin. Now, you'll notice how similar that language is. Exodus 17, it was the wilderness of Sin. Okay, we have in Hebrew, let me just go back there. Wilderness of Sin by stages. Now, that in Hebrew is spelled differently. What's translated sin there is spelled differently with an S letter, as opposed to here, the wilderness of Zin. That is it's another S letter, but it's a different one. Hebrew has different S's. The first one is Samech. This one is Tzadeh, okay, if you know the Hebrew alphabet. So they're nevertheless kind of close, close in terms of name. And we have the same incident going on there that there's an incident about water, like not having water. And in one, Exodus 17, that where we're at today, it doesn't say that Moses sinned. It just says he did what God told him to do in the presence of elders and Aaron and all that. And they went on their way. But at the other one that this refers to, Moses disobeys, has a problem, and then God tells him, look, because of what you did here, you're not going to go into the land of promise. Now, we know these stories, and I don't want to go too far down the rabbit hole of the stories. Are these two traditions conflated into one or separate? I think you can easily tell. For those who want to see sources in the Torah, they're going to look at these and say, well, they're basically the same, but yet they're not. Moses is punished after one, he's not punished at the other. And so they look at this as two sources converging into one, and the editor not getting them quite exactly right, or that sort of thing. And other people would say, no, these are two things that happen at the same place at different times. And, we have separate incidents. Regardless of that, what I want you to notice here, if you want to take either view, that they're separate traditions happen at the same place, or they're two different events that happen at the same place at different times, you have Kadesh associated with Meribah here. That's going to become important. Numbers 33, verses 36 to 37. We read again. The Israelites, set out from Jotbathah and camped at Avronah. And they set out from Avronah and camped at Ezion Geber. And they set out from Ezion Geber and camped in the wilderness of Zin. And then in parentheses it says that is Kadesh. Okay? So again, you have Kadesh being lumped in with these other geographical terms. In the next verse is they set out from Kadesh and camped at Mount Hor on the edge of the land of Edom. Again, right there, it's the same region. Kadesh, Meribah, Refidim, Massah, okay, and Seir, Paran, Edom. Are you getting the picture here? Mount Sinai is somewhere in the mix of all these place names. It's somewhere in there. All of these places are regionally associated with each other. They're close by. Okay, there's a geographical matrix going on here that the Israelites are smack dab in this region. And we know where Edom is. We know where this region is. We know where Seir is. We know what that region is. It's kind of some of them are subsets of others. We know about Edom. We know about Seir. We know about Paran. We know some of these places, and the unknowns like Meribah and Massah and Rephidim. Those are the question marks. But we know generally where these things occurred, and therefore we know generally where Sinai should be, and it's not in Midian. That's the point. You can't get Kadesh in Midian. Kadesh is known. So this isn't, on one hand, this doesn't really help locate Sinai with any precision, but it does hurt the Midian view. It makes it just extraordinarily hard with the rest of the March from the South traditions. So here we are again. Back to ABD, Anchor Bible Dictionary. The writer says, well, let's look at Psalm. He actually brings a psalm in here. He quotes Ezekiel in a few places that places Massah and Meribah at Kadesh. Again, we don't need to read all of these things. Psalm, let's see. I'm going to go there, 81 here. See if I can find this. Oh, let's see. I'll go back up to verse 6. Let's go to verse 4. For it is a statute for Israel, a rule for the God of Jacob. He made it a decree in Joseph, and he went out over the land of Egypt. I hear a language I had not known. I relieved your shoulder of the burden. In distress you called, and I delivered you. And these are all references to Joseph going down to Egypt, God delivering Jacob, Israel. Okay. In distress you called, I delivered you. I answered you in the secret place of thunder. I tested you at the waters of Meribah. Okay. Hear, O my people, while I admonish you, O Israel, if you would but listen to me. And again, it's a reference to Meribah in association with the secret place of thunder, okay, which would be the mountain, okay, where God, answered the call, which was the burning bush incident. So again, you've got Meribah and Sinai again in the same region. There's some geographical proximity going on there. In Anchor Bible Dictionary, the writer says, examination of the text referring to Massah and Meribah shows that there was no unified tradition of what constituted the rebellion. So now they're going to go off into the sources and all that stuff. Let's see. Again, without getting lost in the source talk, the question is, could these things be harmonized for us? That's the question for us, or maybe they're different incidents. Again, and you're going to have scholars on that side as well. The test that they were given involved water, obviously. Psalm 81 implies that all Israel was tested by the waters of Meribah. Then he's going to go, Deuteronomy 33, not so much. It looks like, the priesthood was. So they're going back and forth. And again, the question is, well, maybe these things can be reconciled. Maybe they're two different events that happen at the same place. Again, you're going to have scholars take different positions here. Here's a key thought, though. Psalm 95, 8 through 11, and I'm going to click there, specifies that Israel was punished with 40 years of wandering in the desert for the sin of testing Yahweh at Meribah, but no details are supplied. Now let me read that to you. I'm going to go back up to verse 6. Oh, come, let us worship and bow down. This is Psalm 95, verse 6. Let us kneel before the Lord our Maker, for he is our God. We are the people of his pasture, the sheep of his hand. Today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as at Meribah, as on the day at Massah in the wilderness, when your fathers put me to the test and put me to the proof, though they had seen my work. For 40 years I loathed that generation and said, they are a people who go astray in their hearts, and they have not known my ways. Therefore I swore in my wrath, and they shall not enter my rest. Now, that passage, I'm just going to give you my little take here. That passage doesn't specifically say that the 40 years punishment derived from or was caused by what happened at Massah and Meribah. I think the writer of Anchor Bible Dictionary might be reading that into it. But some scholars do make that argument. Okay, where else, if you remember our series in Hebrew, where did I suggest from other Psalms and from other passages, where did I say that when the writer of Hebrews says they're not going to enter into my rest and then references the Old Testament? Anybody remember what incident the writer of Hebrews took us back to that was the catalyst for the wilderness wanderings? That was Numbers 13 and 14. And what was the failure? It was the report of 10 of the spies who went into the land and saw the Anakim, okay, the descendants of the Nephilim there, and they just quit. That happened at Kadesh. Okay, so you could, again, connect that incident with Meribah if you wanted to, because of they're both connected with Kadesh. So we have another passage, in this case Psalm 95, that has some geographical proximity relationship between not only these place names now, but a specific incident that was the catalyst to the 40 years of wandering, and that just so happened to involve the vestiges of the giant clans. Now that is going to be part 2, because Amalek is intimately connected with the giant clan stuff. We're going to get to that next time. So again, I'll telegraph it a little bit more. We're not done with this yet, but what I want you to see is that we've got a convergence, a concatenation of place names that are regionally in relation to each other. Meribah, Massah, Kadesh, Refidim, Paran, Seir, Edom, and Sinai. The ones that are known are not in Midian. They're just not. They're not on the right-hand side of the right prong of the Red Sea. They're not over there. They are on the other side. They're on the left-hand side near the top. Okay, and Edom is known. Seir is known. For the 4th or 5th time now, if you have not listened to the March from the South episodes related to the location of Sinai, you just have to do that, because that material typically gets skipped or glossed over, or nobody really kind of realizes like what that means in relation to discussing the location of Sinai. And here we have another one, Refidim. So again, I just want you again to realize that while we can't determine these things with the kind of precision we'd like to have, you can whittle away. You can whittle away at it. You can get rid of some options, or at least take some options and label them least likely or something like that, or less likely. Now, again, let's go back to the Meribah, Massah, the Refidim episode here, the incident in the first 7 verses. Again, we now have this associated with the 40-year curse in some way by virtue of Psalm 95. What I'm suggesting is, okay, in some way, again, we've got a couple of incidents at Kadesh / Refidim / Massah Meribah. Maybe things happened at the same place at different times. Okay, maybe again, if you prefer the JEDP approach, well, these are different sources that are trying to put the events together. Again, whichever way you want to go. I mean, I don't think that view is called for. Again, and I'm in part because I think there are other weaknesses to the whole JEDP thing. I mean, I'm a little bit colored by that, but there are differences between them, and there can be different events. There's no rule against that, because now catch this, if these places are regionally, again, close. They're just within a few days of each other, walking around. It is quite conceivable that you could have things happen at the same place or near the same place more than once. I mean, that there's nothing nonsensical about that. That's very possible. So, what are we going to do with that? And if we throw Deuteronomy 33 into it, the giving of the law, Sinai at Meribah Kadesh, okay, it's very possible. Again, these could have been way stations, and they were. We can tell this much from the itinerary. There were way stations on the way to Sinai, and they do have something to do with after Sinai, journeying to Canaan, and then failing, and then being sentenced to wander for 40 years. I mean, basically, they're kind of in the same area. They're just wandering around. Kind of in the Negev somewhere, or, south of Canaan proper, because they're going to emerge. Ultimately after 40 years, they're going to go up the Transjordan from the south, and then cross over into Canaan. During the days of Joshua. I mean, we know how this works, roughly with the itinerary. Again, all of this can work really, except for if you think you're in Midian, then you've got significant problems. And if we throw in the whole, we spent part of an episode on this too, the whole 3 days journey language in the mouth of Moses and Aaron and God himself, in the burning bush incident in Exodus 4, let my people, let my son go out into the wilderness 3 days and offer sacrifice to me. We know where the sacrifice happened. It happens at Sinai, okay? Do we take that literally? I mean, if it's 3 days, then really all of the views of Sinai have a tough time. I mean, even the Kadesh Edom is like, boy, you'd really have to truck it for 3 days, to have 3 days and get out there. I mean, I guess you could make it, maybe. I mean, it's 3 days. Maybe they had to sort of wait to catch their breath before they, did what they're going to do. I mean, who knows? You can quicken the pace dramatically and get there if you're going to take that 3 days literally. This is why some people will say Sinai is Har Karkom, which is a little bit short of some of these other places. Again, but it's still to the south. But to get to Midian in that amount of time is impossible. It's just not feasible. So you have to sort of take the 3 days as not literal. Then you have to ask yourself, well, why does God and Moses? I mean, this is like 4 or 5 times they say this. What's the point? You have to basically take that part of the itinerary not at face value, and then take other parts at face value. And again, there's no sin there. I mean, that's an interpretive strategy to do that. But I want to point out again that even if you quote unquote solve that problem, you've still got this agglomeration of place names all in the same region, but not Midian. Again, you've got a problem there. So I want to just read a couple of excerpts here from people who have taken this information. These are commentators. I don't want to just say that some people say that we've got different incidents at the same places. That's real. I mean, there are scholars who land there. So I don't want you to get the impression that I'm just saying that because I don't like JEDP. Again, I'm not a traditional Mosaic authorship guy, and I'm not a JEDPer. I'm something else. Okay, something in the middle there. But Expositor's Bible Commentary, this is written by Walter Heiser. Okay, Heiser says this. This is his take, commenting about Massah and Meribah, this incident at Refidim. This incident is not to be confused with a similar episode that comes near the conclusion of Israel's 40 years of journeying in Numbers 20. So this one, Exodus 17, is near the beginning, it's a few months, and then the other one is like 40 years later. Again, there are obvious differences here. The incident is not to be confused, again, with the one in Numbers 20. In this later account, the glory of the Lord is not present in that one, whereas he is in Exodus 17. And Moses is explicitly instructed that he is not to strike the rock, but only to speak to it. This shows that the only connections between Israel's need and God's supply was the divine word. True, they also named that place the waters of Meribah, Numbers 20:13, but the symmetry and naming may indeed be deliberate to emphasize the purpose in allowing the incidents and in directing that they be recorded as scripture. God's people are prone to grumbling at the first hint of adversity, no matter how abundant and spectacular may be the evidence of his power and presence. me just stop there. Basically, Heiser's saying, look, they complained at both places, so both incidents, so the terminology is still appropriate. Back to Heiser. Thus, the dual name brought out both the people's testing of God, Masah means to test, and quarreling, Meribah means contention or strife. In less than 6 months, they had witnessed 10 plagues, the pillar of cloud and fire, the opening and shutting of the Red Sea, the miraculous sweetening of the water, the sending of food and meat from heaven. And yet their real question came down to this: is the Lord among us? Like, duh. That's not in Heiser, that's me. I mean, you have this string of events, and you get to Exodus 17, and then their question is the Lord among us? Like, how clueless can you possibly be? And that was Heiser. On the Jewish side, Cassuto, let me quote him. He separates the incidents as well. An incident similar to this one, which took place at the outset of the Israelite itinerary, so in the wilderness, is depicted in another part of the Torah, Numbers 20, verses 1 through 11, dealing with the end of the wanderings. From the literary viewpoint, this provides an interesting example of the symmetry that the biblical style is fond of achieving by means of parallelism between the beginning and conclusion of its narrations. And from a thematic standpoint, we may see in this duplication the intention to substantiate emphatically the tradition concerning the providential care that the Lord gave to the needs of his people in the wilderness from the first to the last stage of their travels. So Cassuto is more or less making it either literary purely, but he also, again, recognizes the disconnect in the chronology and therefore, again, presumably the events. And he's saying, look, these two events are characterized, in very similar ways to create literary symmetry. Again, these are just examples. I just want you to know that, again, there are scholars who disagree on this, and it's really comes down to the authorship debate. But regardless of that, for our purposes, what I want you to get focused on, if you want to rabbit trail on these things, I throw them in sometimes because people are interested in issues like authorship. But for our purposes here, we want to pay attention to where these things in Exodus 17 happen. Again, this concatenation of place names that are associated with Sinai itself, the mountain. I'm going to read what Sarna says here from his Exodus commentary. The Refidim is the last station on the journey from the Sea of Reeds to Sinai, according to Exodus 19:2 and Numbers 33, 14, and 15. So those are the other itineraries. Its location is uncertain. Verse 6 in the present chapter shows that it must be very close to Horeb, Mount Sinai, but the identity of the latter is itself a matter of considerable scholarly controversy. Certainly, a wilderness station must be assumed to be an oasis. Why then was there no water at Rephidim? Unlike the situation at Marah in Exodus 15:23, that's the bitter waters, potability and the quality of the water is not mentioned as a problem here. Therefore, either drought conditions had caused severe depletion of the usually available local resources, or the people were forcibly denied access to them. Now, let me just stop there. What Sarna is making an assumption here that any place that the great company of people would stop, they would only stop if there was a reason to stop, i.e. there was an oasis. There's food and water there. They stock up. And, that makes sense. We're not actually told that, but, there's some sense to that. And so Sarna goes from there, from that point of logic in his head, and says, well, if it was a way station, why wasn't, what's wrong? And he says there's no mention that the water is bitter like at Marah. They just don't have it. So why don't they have it? So he says either there was a drought and it was dried up, or there was some force there preventing them from getting to the water. And he opts for the last one because of what follows in Exodus 17. He says the latter choice, again, they were forcibly denied access to the water. He says the latter seems more plausible because it ties in with the next episode, verses 8 through 16. The hostile Amalekites were in control of this region and blocked the approaches to the sources of water. Again, that's the end of Sarna. So that's his take on how he sets up what's going to happen in what follows. Now, we can look at it and say, well, okay, that might be the case. It says Amalek came and fought with Israel at Refidim. That's Exodus 17:8. It's very clear that there's a conflict. Something starts the conflict. But there's just more to it because of Amalek. And so next time, we're going to get into verses 8 through 16. And the real question we're going to start with is, who are the Amalekites? Now I'm going to seed some things to you so that you can be thinking about them, for next week. So we first encountered the name Amalek in Genesis 36:12. All right? It's one of these boring genealogies. And if we've learned anything on this podcast to this point, it's that boring genealogies sometimes, in case many times, have some really interesting stuff in them. So I'm going to read Genesis 36. I'm going to go back to verse 11, one verse prior, and here's what we read. The sons of Eliphaz were Timon, Omar, Zepho, Gatam, and Kenaz. Verse 12. And 12 is a parenthetical thought, or begins with a parenthetical thought. Timnah was a concubine of Eliphaz, Esau's son. She bore Amalek to Eliphaz. And then it continues, these are the sons of Adah, Esau's wife. So we learn in this parentheses a few things. Timnah was a concubine of Eliphaz, who was Esau's son, whose own mother was Adah, who, if we go back up to Genesis 36:2, we read this. Esau took his wives from the Canaanites. Adah, the daughter of Elon the Hittite, and then a few other women. So we learn that Adah was the daughter of Elon, quote unquote, the Hittite. According to Genesis 36:20 and 22, Timnah was a Horite, Horite. Let me just read Genesis 36:20 and 22. These are the sons of Seir, there's a familiar term, the Horite, the inhabitants of the land, Lotan, Shobal, Zibeon, Anah, Dishan, Ezer, and Dishan. These are the chiefs of the Horites, the sons of Seir in the land of Edom. Horites are in Seir and Edom. Okay. The sons of Lotan were Hori and Himam, and Lotan's sister was Timnah. Okay, so we learn from that genealogy that Timnah, who was the concubine of Eliphaz, who was the son of Esau, okay, and Eliphaz's own mother was Adah, who was the daughter of the Hittites. We learn that Timnah was a Horite, one of the native population of Edom. And the Horites were a people group who lived in the hill country of Seir, according to Genesis 32:3, which says, Jacob sent messengers before him to Esau his brother in the land of Seir, the country of Edom. So Seir is a sub-geographical set of Edom. Seir was part of Edom. You say, well, who cares? Well, we have to ask ourselves, where do we get this grouping elsewhere? Edom, descendants of Esau, the Horites, Seir. Where do we get all that elsewhere? Deuteronomy 2. And if you've read Unseen Realm, that's going to be familiar. Deuteronomy 2, and I'm going to go back to let's go here. Who's the speaker here? Okay, it's Deuteronomy, so we're going to have Moses here. And in verse 9, the Lord said to me, do not harass Moab or contend with them in battle. See that Moses is leading, the Israelites up, the Transjordan here. Do not harass Moab or contend with them in battle, for I will not give you any of their land for a possession, because I have given Ar to the people of Lot for a possession. Verse 10, the Amim formerly lived there, a people great and many, and tall as the Anakim. Like the Anakim, they are also counted as Rephaim, but the Moabites call them Amim. The Horites also live in Seir formerly. They lived there formerly. But the people of Esau dispossessed them and destroyed them from, from the place where they had settled, as Israel did to the land of their possession, which the Lord gave to them. Now rise, go over to the brook of Zered. So we went over to the brook of Zered, at the time from our leaving Kadesh Barnea until we crossed the book of Zerah was 38 years. So they've gone full circle. We began at Kadesh, and they've ended there, and then they go across. Again, we know the familiar story here. But the Horites are mentioned in Deuteronomy 2, verse 12, along with the Amim and the Anakim and the Rephaim. Isn't that interesting? If we keep reading in Deuteronomy 2, we get down to verse 20, and we read this, talking about, again, Ammon in this case, the place Ammon. It is also counted as a land of Rephaim. Rephaim formerly lived there, but the Ammonites called them Zamzumim, a people great and many, and tall as the Anakim, but the Lord destroyed them before the Ammonites, and they dispossessed them and settled in their place, as he did for the people of Esau, who lived in Seir when he destroyed the Horites before them. Now, did you catch the parallelism there? Who are the destroyed them of verse 21? The Zamzumim, the Anakim, the one, or the Rephaim. And who are the destroyed them in verse 22? It's the Horites. Now, this is consistent with Genesis 14, verse 6. This is, the 5 kings against the 4 kings and all that, the Kedor Laomer, passage, which I do not talk about in Unseen Realm, but we're going to get into next week. In the 14th year, Kedor Laomer and the kings who were with him came and defeated the Rephaim and Ashtaroth Karnaim, and the Zuzim and Ham, the Amim and Shaveh Kiriathaim, and the Horites, in their hill country of Seir, as far as El Paran on the border of the wilderness. Then they turned back and came to En Mishpat, that is, Kadesh, and defeated all the country of the Amalekites, and also the Amorites, who were dwelling in Hazazon Tamar. And of course, we know from Amos 2, 9, and 10 that the Amorites were tall as cedars. Right? You see the picture emerging here. I mean, we've already gone to Numbers 13. That's, again, the famous Nephilim Anakim passage. Just look at that. Well, I can't help but go to Numbers 13. There's 26 through 23, and especially 28 to 33. It's 26 to 33, and it just there's a lot packed into this. Pay attention here especially to verses 28 and 29. So it says, however, the people who dwell in the land, again, this is the bad report from the spies. The people who dwell in the land are strong, and the cities are fortified and very large. And besides, we saw the descendants of Anak there. And then you get the grocery list. Amalekites dwell in the land of the Negev, the Hittites, the Jebusites, and the Amorites dwell in the hill country, and the Canaanites dwell by the sea along the Jordan. And then you go down to verse 33, we saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak, who come from the Nephilim, and we seemed to ourselves like grasshoppers, and so we seemed to them. Where does that incident take place? Numbers 13:26. And they came to Moses and Aaron and all the congregation of the people of Israel in the wilderness of Paran. Can you believe that? Paran. Deuteronomy 33, Paran is where Sinai. Paran at Kadesh. Numbers 13:26 actually says that the failure with the giant clans occurs in the wilderness of Paran at Kadesh. They're right back into it. When you hit, again, the incident in Exodus 17 with the Amalekites from verses 8 through 16, it's the same area. It's also where Sinai, I mean, can you believe this? The place where they fail because of the giant clans, this region is peppered, sprinkled, again, with more of these people. Now, there had been a lot more of them in the past, because the descendants of Esau and Ammon and Moab, they've wiped out the Amim and the Zuzim and the Zamzumim, and the Horites are always mentioned with them, with those other groups. And interestingly enough, Amalek's mom was a Horite. So that's what we got going there. Again, it's cosmic geographical stuff that you wouldn't necessarily pick up on unless you're looking back and looking at some of the genealogies and some of these place names and they, how they sort of conglomerate together. The Amalek incident occurs in the same vicinity as the later failure of Numbers 13 and 14, which is the catalyst of the 40 years wandering. Now, Moses and Joshua here, think about this. Moses and Joshua are going to defeat the Amalekites, whose lineage goes back to the Horites, one of the people associated with the giant clans. We don't have the giants specifically mentioned in Exodus 17 unless you count the Horites. That they're, again, in that people group, there's some of these because they're always mentioned with the other ones. All the way back to Genesis 14. Look at the list. You've got Rephaim, this is from verse 5 to verse 7. Rephaim, Zuzim, Amim, and the Horites in the country of Seir, the hill country of Seir. And the hill country is a big deal too, because when you actually get into the conquest accounts, the places where you get the killing language, again, to target the Anakim, is typically in the hill country. And these things overlap. These things overlap, and they have relationships to each other. Amorites, Amalekites, Horites. Again, the other ones sort of get more press because we think for some reason that they're the ones specifically associated with the Rephaim and the Anakim. They really all are. All of these subgroups. So, I mean, it tells you that among these people groups, in these geographical areas, or this wide geographical region, both south of Canaan and then in the Transjordan on the other side, this is where all this action takes place. And we have all of these common associations. And here's the surprise. Sinai is somewhere in the middle of that because of these geographical place names. Again, it's just, I've mentioned it before, you can't get this, you can't get all this stuff. It's not just one or two things that you got to somehow get it over into Midian. You got to get all of this in Midian. And I don't know how you're going to do that. I mean, there's more going on than just one or two place names. It's all of this activity and this action, and Kadesh is known. Seir is known. Edom is known. Lots of the other places aren't, but there are some that are. And Sinai is somewhere in the middle of all this stuff. Doesn't that set up the giving of the law, the fact that God is camped out in the middle of this? I mean, it just adds another layer to the whole series of confrontations. God essentially going into a place that he's been cleaning house there before Moses and the Israelites ever get there. He's using other descendants of Abraham to do the job. And again, if you've read Unseen Realm, you know that this is ultimately about God's victory over chaos. And the victory over chaos is intimately associated with Babel and Babylon. And not coincidentally, it's not only what happens in Genesis 11 that's connected to Babel, it's also what happens in Genesis 6 that's connected to Babel. Again, it's a matrix of ideas. I mean, how many times have I said that? You have a matrix of ideas that are at work, running underneath the surface of these sorts of things. And so where does God put his own place? Right in the middle of that, because he's going to do away with it. He's going to clean house. He's going to establish his beachhead right in the middle of this stuff. That's where he's going to begin his, to make new, to revive, to make alive again his presence on earth. I mean, think Eden. Again, the kickstarting Eden, the phrase I use in Unseen Realm a lot. This is where he decides to do it. This is the beachhead right here. And then he's going to move with the people from Sinai into Canaan. And what was cleaned up in the Sinai region, again, Seir, Edom, Paran, Kadesh, Rephidim, all this, that's just going to move. That's just going to migrate into Canaan proper. And the Israelites are supposed to do the same thing there. Get rid of the vestiges of the Babel chaos. That's what you're here for. And this is where we are going to start, the next installment, the next phase of salvation history, to restore Eden and unify what was lost, what was disinherited at Babel. Again, all these Babylonish connections mean something, but we often don't notice them. And again, we'll flesh this out, next time in part two. I don't want to. I mean, I could. It's just cool stuff. Okay. I mean, I don't want to run down the road too far just to set this up. But next time in part two, we're going to devote a full episode to this. We'll get into Genesis 14 again, which I did not, include an unseen realm. We're going to get into that. We're going to get into these people group names, and then we'll take a look at what happens again in the conflict with Amalek. But there's a lot that's just lurking under the surface here.
The second part here, I telegraphed you kind of what we were going to do here at the end of part one. And the focus is Exodus 17, 8 through 16. And so we might as well, as we begin, just read those verses again. So this is the Amalek incident. Earlier in the chapter, we had the incident at Refidim, which is, close to Sinai proper. We had the Meribah incident, and we talked about geographically, where these things are. That we have a cluster of terms now by the time we hit Exodus 17. Seir, Edom, Paran, Timon, Rephidim, all these different places. Kadesh was an important one that we talked about last time. That cluster, Midian is the outlier. As we said before, if you go way back, to the episodes we did on Midian and the location of Sinai, the only way you can really factor Midian in is if it's like bordering, this area. But the places that are known here are not in Midian proper, and so that's a big problem for that view of Sinai. But we talked about the geography last time and where this happens, and basically to make the point, look, if all these places are sort of associated regionally with Sinai, then you have some cosmic geography going on. And when you have in verse 8, Amalek, it says, came and fought with Israel at Rephidim. You have these people coming into what could very well be, since Rephidim and Massah and Meribah are associated with Kadesh, and again, Kadesh with Paran and Timon and Seir, Edom, Sinai, all that kind of stuff. You could have essentially an infiltration by these outsiders of, what's going to be, or what would be conceived of as holy ground, sort of the environs around Sinai, very, very close to it. And, we made the comment, we asked the question, actually, who is Amalek? And Amalek has a history that we will repeat in this episode, just to get us into it, that is associated with all the giant clan stuff. So let's jump in here to verse 8, and I'm just going to read 8 through 16. Then Amalek came and fought with Israel at Rephidim. So Moses said to Joshua, choose for us men and go out and fight with Amalek. Tomorrow I will stand on the top of the hill with the staff of God in my hand. So Joshua did as Moses told him and fought with Amalek, while Moses, Aaron, and Hur went up to the top of the hill. Whenever Moses held up his hand, Israel prevailed, and whenever he lowered his hand, Amalek prevailed. But Moses' hands grew weary, so they took a stone and put it under him, and he sat on it, while Aaron and Hur held up his hands, one on one side and the other on the other side. So his hands were steady until the going down of the sun, and Joshua overwhelmed Amalek and his people with the sword. Then the Lord said to Moses, write this as a memorial in a book and recite it in the ears of Joshua, that I will utterly blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven. And Moses built an altar and called the name of it, The Lord is my banner, saying, a hand upon the throne of the Lord. The Lord will have war with Amalek from generation to generation. Now, what you typically hear with this is that here you have a rogue, people. There's nothing typically unusual about them. They essentially molest Israel on their way to Sinai. I mean, basically, Israel's practically at Sinai, so they're preventing Israel from getting to the mountain of God, and that's so offensive that from here on out, that God is angry at the Amalekites. And that's not untrue, but there's just more lurking in the story than you would suspect. So in the last episode, like I said, we asked, who were the Amalekites? And I'll confess, this episode is going to feel like a long rabbit trail before we return back to the passage and make a few observations. But again, I think it's worth it because this is the kind of thing we do in the Naked Bible that nobody else does. Get into some of the weeds here, and there are some really interesting things. So, despite the fact that it's going to be feel like a long rabbit trail, I want to establish that I'm not making up the association of Amalek to terms or people names or labels that are clearly associated with giant clans. I'm not making it up. And you can find these connections in scholarship, and you basically, you find all the data points, and then you connect the dots. It's not rocket science in that respect, but you're never going to see these things unless you go looking. So basically, if all you want to know is whether it's reasonable to think that this conflict with Amalek was possibly, at least in part, a conflict with giant clan population, the answer is yes. But explaining why or how that worked in the mind of the biblical writer is, I'll be honest here, that would be a book-length task. So what I'm going to try to do here is summarize a few things in what will feel, again, like a rabbit trail, and then take it back to Exodus 16, 8 through 16, and read that episode supernaturally, or as some would prefer to call it, mythic history. Events on the ground that are happening that have a strong, supernaturalistic, divine, in this case, quasi-divine feel to it. So that's what we're going to do in this episode. So we first encounter Amalek, as I mentioned in part 1, in Genesis 36:12. That's where we get the name, and I'll just read Genesis 36:11 and 12. The sons of Eliphaz were Timon, Omar, Zepho, Gatam, and Kenaz. Verse 12. Timnah was a concubine of Eliphaz, Esau's son. She bore Amalek to Eliphaz. These are the sons of Adah, Esau's wife. So we learn from that little bit that Timnah is a concubine of Eliphaz, who was Esau's son, whose own mother was Adah, who, if we go back to Genesis 36, verse 2, we find that Adah was the daughter of Elon the Hittite. According to Genesis 36:20 through 22, a few verses later, Timnah was a Horite, that's Horite, one of the native population of Edom. Now, the Horites are going to be our focus today. They were a people group who lived in the hill country of Seir, and Genesis 32, verse 3, tells us that Seir was part of Edom. And according to Deuteronomy 2, verses 10 through 12, verses 20 through 23, we learn that the Horites were defeated and displaced by the Edomites, and they are listed in those passages in Deuteronomy with other people groups that are incontestably giant clans. So this raises the question of, well, who are these Horites exactly? And answering that question requires investigating the contexts in which the Horites are mentioned and doing a little digging into the other people groups with whom they are listed. So again, this is the direction we're going to go, that we have, an association with, again, what is going to emerge as a giant clan population, the Horites. Esau's line has a child by one of these women, and that child is Amalek. And Amalek is the, forefather, the forerunner of the Amalekites. So there's this, line of descent, pardon the pun, that we can look at and say, well, isn't it odd, again, that these are the people that sort of surface when the Israelites are trying to get to Yahweh's domain. And isn't it interesting that Yahweh's domain is sort of smack dab in the middle of this? Because when we have these complex of geographical place names, Seir, Edom, Paran, Taman, Kadesh, Massah, Meribah, Refidim, okay, all these places, this concatenation of places, we learn from Deuteronomy 2 that earlier than the days of Moses and Joshua, they were just, infested with these giant clans. And the descendants of Esau got rid of most of them. You actually have references to other people, like the Philistines, when they come into the area, they get rid of them. One of the populations as well. I mean, you have the Genesis 14 incident where some of this happens. But it's as though, I'm going to telegraph where we're going here. It's as though God has sort of planted himself in the middle of the chaos tribes, the chaos vestiges of Genesis 6. because we know that these people groups, we know this again from Deuteronomy 2, both of those passages, that these are the people who are Rephaim, and the Rephaim are Anakim, and the Anakim, by virtue of Numbers 13, 32, and 33, were descended from the Nephilim. Okay, it's as though God just sort of camps right in the middle of this, kind of to make a statement, and then waits there until his own choice of timing to bring his people, Israel, again, the people that he created supernaturally after the Babel incident, to this place. And in the centuries prior to that, he is using other lines of Abraham and even other peoples, from other nations, to eliminate these giant clans, sort of to clean house before company gets there, i.e., before the Israelites get there. So again, this is sort of the big picture view of what's going on here in terms of, again, a supernatural outlook of what's going on in these stories. So Deuteronomy 2, let's go back there, 10 through 12, and then 20 through 23, established the Horites lived in Seir, which is a sub-region of Edom. Refidim is, of course, again associated with Massah and Meribah, which in other passages, and we mentioned this last time, are explicitly associated with Kadesh. And Kadesh was, of course, the place that Israel failed. Later on, when after Sinai, after they get to Sinai, they get the law. Now it's time to go on to the Promised Land. They're going to come back to Kadesh, and they're going to fail. They're going to send in the 12 spies. 10 of them are going to come back, and they're going to say, forget it. We've looked in there at the land, and we know who's there. We know the Anakim are there. It's worse than we thought. Now, if they're encountering some of these people at the incident at Refidim, they should have known that God was capable of delivering them. But they fail at basically the same region, same location, regionally, here at Kadesh. And then that's what initiates the 40 years of wandering. So, we sort of come full circle in a short amount of time, 13 months later, because they're going to be at Sinai for 13 months. So, a little over a year later, they circle around, circle back. They're going to go up, through this area. Again, the march from the south, themes that we get in the Hebrew Bible about where Israel comes from to enter the land, or where Yahweh comes from. And here we go. We encounter, some of the same, basically the same situation, probably magnified, more of them. And they just quit. 10 of the spies say, forget it. We can't do it. And then we get 40 years of wandering. So when it comes to the Horites specifically, where we want to camp here, we have limited passages. We have Genesis 36, which we looked at. We've got Deuteronomy 2, 10 through 12, Deuteronomy 2, 20 through 23. And the other passage where they're mentioned is Genesis 14, 5 through 7. So Deuteronomy 2 is where, we'll start here. That should be pretty familiar. And I'm going to read the passages in total just so that they're fresh in the minds of the listeners. And then I'm going to make a few observations. So Deuteronomy 2:10 says this: the Amim formerly lived there, a people great and many and tall as the Anakim. Like the Anakim, they are also counted as Rephaim, but the Moabites call them Amim. The Horites also lived in Seir formerly, but the people of Esau dispossessed them and destroyed them from before them, and settled in their place as Israel did to the land of their possession, which the Lord gave to them. I skip down a little bit, Deuteronomy 2:20. It is also counted as a land of Rephaim. This is in reference to Ammon now. Rephaim formerly lived there, but the Ammonites called them Zamzumim, a people great and many, and tall as the Anakim. But the Lord destroyed them before the Ammonites, and they dispossessed them and settled in their place, as he did for the people of Esau who live in Seir, when he destroyed the Horites before them, and they dispossessed them and settled in their place even to this day. As for the Avim, who lived in villages as far as Gaza, the Kaphtorim, who came from Kaphtor destroyed them and settled in their place. That's Deuteronomy 2:20 and 23. And there's some interesting things. You can already see how what's said about the Amim is almost word for word what's said about the Zamzumim. And again, referencing them as Rephaim and tall like the Anakim. And then that language, some of it is applied to the Horites. Okay, you just read through the passages and you can notice that. So a couple of observations. Here's what's sort of obvious. The Horites are mentioned in connection with both the Amim, the giant clan of Moab, and the Rephaim Zamzumim, giants of Ammon. The Horites are right smack dab in the middle of that. Secondly, Deuteronomy 2 tells us the people of Esau destroyed these giant clans and also destroyed the Horites. Why include the Horites in this description, unless there was a reason to do so? Third, along with the Amim, Zamzumim, Rephaim, and the Horites, the Avim are mentioned as also being destroyed by the people, by people who came in. Interestingly, in this case, it's the Caphtorim, okay, people from Caphtor. Now, the Avim were said to have lived in villages as far as Gaza, okay, which is on the coast. That's going to become Philistine territory. So we have another people group of interest here, the Avim, and they live again in what would be a traditional Philistine area by the time the Philistines really get some attention in the Hebrew Bible. They are again part of this complex. They also show up in Joshua 13 verses 3 through 4. I'll read that. From the Shihor, which is east of Egypt, northward to the boundary of Ekron, it is counted as Canaanite. There are 5 rulers of the Philistines, those of Gaza, Ashdod, Ashkelon, Gath, and Ekron, and those of the Avim. In the south, all the land of the Canaanites, and Me'arah that belongs to the Sidonians, to Aphek, to the boundary of the Amorites. Now you get a bunch of people groups in there. We're going to talk about who some of these groups are and their history, and how, more importantly, 2 things. How these people would have been perceived by their contemporaries, by ancient people. And then later on, when we get the Israelites in the picture, how the biblical writers especially would have been using these terms, these people group terms of the population of Canaan. Those are 2 related but somewhat distinct issues. Now, there's a book I'd recommend if people who are really into this. I recommend this book because it's not easy to find a lot of information about some of these groups because they're basically mentioned once or twice. Avim, you get into the lists of people that are targeted, the Girgashites, the Jebusites, the Perizzites, the Kerethites, all that stuff. There aren't that many good sources, but one of them is by Baruch Margalit. It's called The Sea Peoples in the Bible. The Sea Peoples, for those who aren't familiar with the term, they were people from the Aegean who come from that area, cross the relevant portions of the Mediterranean, and they settle in Canaan eventually. You get them in Canaan, in Syria. They try to attack Egypt. This is where we know the Sea Peoples from, basically Egyptian texts, because the Egyptians had to essentially defeat them and thwart their infiltration. But we don't have an empire in Canaan, so that was just easy pickings for the Sea Peoples to get in there and either decide to live there or move on and invade somebody else. So the Sea Peoples, one of them are the Peleshet, which in biblical language are the Philistines. But some of these other terms that you get with these people groups are derivative from names for the Sea Peoples. So this is a good resource, The Sea Peoples in the Bible by Margalit. That's Margolith. And according to that book, the Avim basically get defeated. The Avim are people that are there before the Sea Peoples get there. They're defeated by the Philistines, and his take on Joshua 13 is that they essentially, the survivors, the ones that aren't killed, essentially get absorbed into the population of the Philistines. Now, what's also going to happen by the time you get to the days of the conquest is that you're going to have the sons of Anak, the Anakim, those that escape Joshua, they're going to go as well to these places, to the Philistine cities. We know that from Joshua 12, for instance. So, you've got vestiges of the giant clans that are going, these places are going to become known for. Having said that, it seems, and if you do a lengthy study of the Philistines, that you have, since the Philistines are the sea peoples and they come from the Aegean, you also have giant traditions. We'll just put it that way. These giant warrior traditions, this sort of subpopulation. You have some of that in ancient Greek. Again, speaking broadly, material, and some of that gets wrapped up in with the sea peoples, and so it's quite possible that you have some of this kind of thing going on with these these people that are unusually tall and are perceived again as divine offspring and whatnot, especially by the biblical writers. They are agents of chaos because of their history. The Aegean, again, we have to remember this. There's sort of two parts to the Aegean. There's the Greek part, and then on the east you have Anatolia, which is where you're going to get some of these other people groups. You're going to get the Mitanni, you're going to get the Hurrians, and a lot of scholars, and I think there's good evidence for this. We're going to go through some of it today. Think that the Horites were the Hurrians. You've got people coming from the Caucasus, from Turkey, what is now Turkey, down into the land. And their history is directly traceable back to Babylon. So the ancient person is going to sort of know, again, the ancient writer anyway, somebody who's literate, is going to know basically the bloodlines, the genealogies, the history of these peoples. And all that the biblical writers are going to need to know is that, look, we have here vestiges of certain places in Mesopotamia, specifically Babylon, that's the big one, who, again, are going to be perceived as generational offspring, agents of chaos. They're going to emerge, again, from in Babylon's case, the Apkallu incident in the Era epic. This is how these people groups are going to be perceived. So some of them are going to come across the Mediterranean. They're going to settle in Canaan, even before we have the descendants of Esau, even before we have Moses and Joshua. And the descendants of Esau are going to wipe some of them out. Abraham, again, that whole incident in Genesis 14, they're going to be involved in that. And then, of course, here with Moses and Joshua. So there's a history here of certain people groups getting into Canaan that God is going to providentially deal with. And they have a long Mesopotamian history that goes all the way back to Babylon. That's what I want to try to sort of flesh out and explain in the time we have left for this episode. So the Avim, in a nutshell, are pre-Philistine sea people. And when I say pre-Philistines, I'm talking about the Philistines we know from the Bible that have settled in these cities. The Avim are going to have lived there before. They're going to come from the same areas as the Philistines are ultimately going to come from, but they're going to be conquered by the Philistines, and they're going to just be eliminated and absorbed. So they're pre-Philistine sea people, and Bowling, in his Anchor Bible Yale commentary, when he's commenting on Joshua 3, puts it this way: they were settled in the neighborhood of Gaza only to be at last attacked and displaced by people from Kaftor, which is Crete. That is, again, the Philistines. Unquote. He adds, interestingly enough, that the Septuagint, where we have Avim in these two passages, the Joshua passage, and then the one here in Deuteronomy, the Septuagint translates that as huio, which the Septuagint translator also uses to render Hivites. And the Hivites, again, are one of these people groups in the conquest that, again, we know almost nothing about. So there's a chance that they could have been the same, or at least perceived as the same. That's from Bowling's commentary in the Anchor Bible series. So what we glean from all this is that it would be odd to have the Horites thrown into this mix, where by the time Joshua at least gets written, these places are going to be characterized, known for giant clans. So it would be odd to have the Horites and, frankly, the Avim thrown into that mix if they weren't also, because they're described as being targeted in some cases by the same descendants, from Abraham, the line of Esau, or others. Why would you throw them in there? Why would you even mention them if they weren't part of the same problem, if they weren't part of the same sort of targeted group? That the biblical writers want us to realize that, hey, God was basically getting rid of these vestiges of the days of chaos, the days of primeval chaos, the descendants of if you're a Mesopotamian, the Apkallu, or descendants of the Nephilim. God was already at work getting rid of those individuals. They were the biggest threat, even before Israel got there. And so why, if you're trying to make that point and you throw the Horites in, it stands to reason that, okay, we've got something going on here with the Horites. Now, the Horites themselves, we know from the Bible they preceded the Edomites in Seir. We know their lineage and all that stuff. Tigay writes, it is uncertain whether they are connected with the Horians, a non-Semitic people spread through the Near East in the 3rd and 2nd millennia BC. And he's right. It's not certain, but a good case can be made for that. And so I'm going to follow that trajectory. The possible link to the Hurrians is better addressed in conjunction with Genesis 14. And I'm not going to go too far into Genesis 14 here, because a lot of this material is going to be, I'm going to do a presentation at a conference in Lubbock very shortly now, in the middle of August. And this is going to be my topic, so I don't want to tip too much of my hand there. So I want people to come to that. It's Judd Burton's conference, but I'm going to read this and we'll say a few things about it. Genesis 14, 5 through 7, if we read, again, that passage, here's what we get. This is that confederation of kings in Abraham's day. It says this. I'll go back to in the 14th year, Kedorlaomer and the kings who were with him came and defeated the Rephaim in Ashtaroth Karnaim, the Zuzim in Ham, the Amim in Shaveh Kiriathaim, and the Horites in their hill country of Seir, as far as El Paran on the border of the wilderness. Then they turned back and came to En Mishpat, that is Kadesh, and defeated all the country of the Amalekites, and also the Amorites who were dwelling in Hazon Tamar. Amalekite there is something of an anachronism. Again, you have to realize Genesis 14 is written after the time of Esau, and it's going to be one of his sons whose concubine is actually the mother of Amalek. So the Amalekites there is a bit of an anachronism. And we've encountered this thing before in Exodus. You get it lots of places in the Old Testament because of the time of when something is written. But look at the names here. I mean, it's very obvious what you have going on here. You've got the Rephaim mentioned, the Zuzim, the Amim, the Amorites, which is the name used in the book of Amos for the giant clans generally, Amos 2, 9, and 10. The Amalekites, again, who descend from the Horites. And then, of course, you get the Horites thrown in here. Again, why would you put the Horites in here when everything else? Why would you put the Horites in there and then their descendant, Amalek, in this list unless you have the same kind of problem? There's just no reason to do it, because everything else in the list, again, is very explicitly associated with the giants, giant clan stuff. So, again, this is what we're dealing with here. Now, let's go to Mesopotamian sources. We don't want to lose sight. The Amalekites are derivative of the Horites. The Horites are likely, again, Tigay says it's uncertain, but again, you can make a good case for this. They're likely to be associated with a people called the Horians. And the Horians have some relationship association with the Amorites, at least in Mesopotamian sources. So what I want to do here is talk about other sources, Mesopotamian stuff. They know these people, and these people have a history. And what I'm going to point out here is that the names of individual people groups here are going to be used by biblical writers intentionally to take the mind of the reader back to the chaos of Babylon. What we get in the Bible is Horites and Hittites is another one of these. Some of these, even Philistines, some of the Genesis passages. But some of these names don't refer ethnically to people. They sort of become swear words or bad words, bad labels that you would stick on people that you are afraid of or that you just don't like. Bad guys. And that is the way the biblical writers will use terms like Amorite, okay, even Canaanite, Horite, Amalekite, but especially the Amorites and the Horites here, because they have a long history. If the Horites are Hurrians, there's a history here in Mesopotamian sources that explain why, sort of give you some of the background as to why these names would be associated with Babylon itself. So to summarize what the primary sources of Mesopotamia show, here's just a bullet point list. Before the biblical patriarchs, before their time, in northwest Syria or Lebanon, that's the area geographically just north of Canaan, and in northwest Mesopotamia, if you think of the Tigris and Euphrates, those rivers extend almost, into Syria. So, and again, that's just above Canaan. Before the time of the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, in these areas, northwest Syria, Lebanon, northwest Mesopotamia, those places were occupied by a people known in Mesopotamian sources as Amorites. Now, these Amorites migrated east into Mesopotamia at some point before the third dynasty of Ur, which is still before the time of Abraham. They were therefore called by the Mesopotamians, the native Mesopotamian population. They were called Amuru. That's where Amorite comes from. And that means Westerner, okay, people that come from the West. The Sumerian equivalent is Mar-Tu. Amuru, Mar-Tu, it's the same thing, just different languages. These Amorites eventually take control of Mesopotamia. They literally just run through Mesopotamia, the city-states there, including Babylon. What we don't realize is that Hammurabi, the great Hammurabi, was an Amorite. Okay, his dynasty was an Amorite dynasty. The Amorites took over Babylon. So what the biblical writers thought of as Babylonian then was historically Amorite. Okay, that's an important point to keep back in the back of your mind. When the biblical writers are talking about the Babylonians, yeah, it's people that live in Babylon. Okay, we get that. But the people who are in control in certain periods of time are actually these Amorites. So Amorite and Babylonian, in some contexts, they're almost synonymous. Again, like Hammurabi would be the best example. His dynasty was an Amorite dynasty. And the Amorites ruled most of the city-states in Mesopotamia. Now, when you get to around 1500 BC, which might be, again, the early date of the Exodus, again, right around there was another migration that occurred from the north. Another group, the Mitanni, which was a federation of Hurrian states. The Hurrians are another people group. They sweep down from Anatolia, so from part of the region that would have been associated with sea people. They sweep down from Anatolia through Syria. Some of them settle in Canaan. That was pretty minimal. They're going to, again, do the same thing the Amorites did. They're going to go through Mesopotamia. And they get all the way to Babylon. They actually conquer Babylon, but then for some reason, they turn around and they go home. So they don't stay there. But what's left is a sort of a combination of still native Babylonians, Amorites, and now you've got some Hurrians or Horites in the same area. We're going to focus on Babylon. It's more than Babylon, but Babylon's the big deal here. So here we have all three of these terms: Horite, Amorite, Babylonian. You could even throw Hittite in here because from Anatolia, that's where the Hittite Empire was. So you get some Hittite presence there. These names, again, I think you can already see where this is going, are names that show up in the conquest accounts, biblically, for not only people who need to be defeated, but several of them are associated with the giant clans, and that shouldn't be a surprise because Genesis 6:1 through 4, the context for that, those 4 verses, really the first, really 5 verses, if you want to be honest here. The context for that whole episode is the Apkallu story from Mesopotamia, which is focused on Marduk, Marduk's reaction. Marduk is the one who punishes the Apkallu and all that kind of, which is Babylon. I mean, again, you have this matrix of ideas associated with individuals. Again, the descendants of the Apkallu, which were half divine, half human, and they were giants. Gilgamesh, all this kind of stuff. You're basically throwing all this into the hopper, and along with these place names. And for an Israelite, for a biblical writer, these are the worst of times and the worst of people. What happens here with the Apkallu to a Mesopotamian, they're heroes because they save, they restore, civilization after the flood. And Babylon's so wonderful, and we owe this to the Apkallu, our divine overlords, or whatever, people that helped the kings and gave them wisdom and all this kind of stuff. Okay, but if you're a biblical writer, especially if you're writing Genesis 1 through 11, either editing it heavily or composing it during the exile in Babylon, okay, these are the worst of people and the worst of times. This is chaos central. This is anti-Eden. The conditions that emerge from this incident, the flood incident with the sons of God, again, the Apkallu and the Mesopotamian story. Again, that is the worst of the worst. They are the very manifestation of the anti-Eden world. So this is how a biblical person, a biblical writer is going to think about that. And when they're thinking about Babylon as anti-Eden, if they know the history of the place, they're also going to lump in the Hurrians, the Horites, the Amorites, again, all these other terms. And so when they write, again, about the conquest, they're going to be using these terms to label people that just generally oppose Yahweh and oppose the re-implantation of Eden. In other words, the kingdom of God, Yahweh's people in his land and his temple, all that stuff. They're going to be standing in the way. And if they happen to be unusually tall, they're the worst of the worst. They're the biggest threat. They are the personifications of anti-Eden. And this is how this set of circumstances is parsed in the mind of the biblical writer. So when we encounter these terms in the Old Testament, again, we shouldn't be surprised if we know a little of the history. Where else do we learn about Eden in the Old Testament? Isaiah 14, Ezekiel 28. You go back and read that stuff, ask yourself the question, are there Babylonian elements in those episodes too, in those diatribes against the king? Well, good grief, Isaiah, king of Babylon, and he's the one that it's directed at. And again, using the story of divine rebellion, again, I hope, again, listeners have read Unseen Realm, because I can't rehearse the content of Unseen Realm in every episode, or even any episode. But this diatribe against the king of Babylon is using the story of a supernatural rebellion in the heavens, in the council, to comment on or go after the hubris of the king of Babylon. But it's Babylon again. Okay, it's this rebellion motif, which again, if you're familiar with the Genesis 6 story, you get that. If you go back, to what happens in Eden, rebellion of one particular divine being, a member of Yahweh's council, to eliminate the humans that he doesn't want. There you are again. Again, there are Babylonish elements to all of the stories in Genesis 1 through 11. That is not an accident. You're supposed to be thinking anti-Eden in all these stories. And not only anti-Eden in terms of people, what people do to screw up, but supernatural agents who are in rebellion against the true God, and who not only are adversarial in their relationship to him, but they are adversarial in their relationship to his human family. This is what all this stuff is about on a cosmic geographical level. Ezekiel 28, cherubim. I mean, you get the Mesopotamian, the Babylonish elements there. And Ezekiel's writing from where? Babylon. Okay. Again, all of these things are factors in the way writers are writing things and the way their readers are deciphering what's being written. So when you come across Babylonish stuff and some of these other, again, people group names and even the place names, you should be thinking that the thing that should pop into your head from this point forward, hopefully, is anti-Eden. That is an agent of Eden, an agent against Eden. He's a representative of anti-Eden chaos, because that's what an Israelite's going to be thinking. That's how they're going to be parsing these things. Isaiah 14, Ezekiel 28, they're not lessons on, heavenly zoology. Okay, I've run into people all the time. Well, explain the anatomy of the cherub. If you're going down those rabbit trails, you're missing the point. These are metaphors. Okay, they are descriptions, images, iconographic descriptions. Okay, of agents that the biblical person would have immediately associated with Babylon and anti-Eden. That is how you're supposed to be thinking about these passages, not getting a heavenly zoology lesson. And it's the same thing for some of the terminology here associated with people groups. It's not a geography lesson. These terms are being used to conjure, to produce certain ideas, thought patterns in the reader's head. And the main thought pattern is chaos, anti-Eden, enemy of Eden. And specifically, some of those enemies that come from the Nephilim, the Apkallu, and the Mesopotamian side. The worst of the worst. And this is how, the writers are trying to get their readers to think. Now, a few notes on the term Amorite. Again, this is from Anchor Bible Dictionary. The term Amuru first occurs in old Akkadian sources as the general designation of the West, referring to the west wind and to the geographical area lying to the northwest of Mesopotamia. The most frequent usage of the term refers to the population of that western region as an ethnic designation. Again, in those days, its semantic equivalent, Sumerian Mar-2, was used already in the 3rd millennium BC, even at Ebla, in an ethnic or cultural sense, designating the population of the West. Okay, that was recognized to be foreign. These are foreigners. To the Mesopotamians, the Amorites were foreigners, that are going to invade their own lands. It's going to be bad, but they're going to become the Babylonians, okay, that the biblical writers know. Amorite is not a Semitic language. Okay, well, let me be more precise. It can't be established as a Semitic language. It's something different. Akkadian is Semitic. It's East Semitic. Sumerian, of course, is something different. Amorite is different than that. It's not related to Hebrew or Ugaritic. It's not part of the Northwest Semitic group. They were their own people. They're foreigners, okay? And again, recent studies of Amorite have established this. For those of you who are interested in this sort of thing, Journal of Semitic Studies actually just came out with an article, Alexander Andresen and Juan Pablo Vida, Amorite, a Northwest Semitic language, ? And they basically conclude that, we really can't say that it's Semitic. It has features of Semitic, but there's lots of stuff that is just totally different. So I mention this not for some language lesson, but these are outsiders. They're foreigners. Now, what we know of them, though, Amorite has produced, at least to date, no text. There are no Amorite texts, like literary texts or even economic texts. What we do have are, the neighborhood of 6,000 or so personal names that are Amorite. You're familiar with biblical names, how you can sort of take them apart and they say something. Biblical names have a grammar. Okay, Daniel, God is my judge. Okay, it's actually a verbalist clause. Okay, Amorite is the same way, and other names in other languages too. And we have about 6,000 of these, and they come from all parts of Mesopotamia. So it's demonstrable that the Amorites, both by the evidence of personal names and what the Mesopotamians actually say later on, took over the whole area. I mean, this is an invasion. And it was viewed, negatively by the people of the time, but they become what the biblical writers know as Babylon. You get the same thing as I mentioned before with the Mitanni, the Hurrians. Mitanni is a kind of an empire name, but it's actually a confederation of Hurrian city-states from North Mesopotamia. Again, they do the same thing, just like I described a few minutes ago. So this is what you have, happening. You have all of these people sweeping down, invading what would become biblical Babylon. And the names of these people sort of become part of a metaphorical vocabulary to take the mind of the biblical reader back to this place, specifically to Babylon. That's ground zero for the anti-Eden. And when you do that, and you're talking about giants, you as an Israelite, again, a literate Israelite, are going to think, oh yeah, I know why Genesis 6:1-4 is there. The Mesopotamians thought these were great. This was great after the flood, that the sons of God, the divine beings, the Apkallu, came and, had children that were hybrids and all this kind of stuff. And they thought that was great. It saved their civilization. But we know, again, this led to disaster, depravity, idolatry, people forsaking the true God and worshiping these other beings as gods, and so on and so forth. I mean, this is where the writer wants to take the mind of the reader. Because an Israelite, let's face it, again, this is what we do here at Naked Bible. I've made the comment a number of times. You run across these weird passages, weird people groups, weird names. The Israelite who's living, in the first millennium BC or even the early second millennium BC, they're going to know just what to do with this stuff. They're going to know. They're going to know what it means. They're going to know sort of where to plug it in their worldview and their theology. They're just going to know because it's part of their world. We don't know any of it. So we have to go back and try to recover it. And so, again, to us, it's difficult. It's work. But, that's what we try to do here. I want to read one other selection here. I go back to Anchor Bible Dictionary. Amorite as a political designation. ABD says, it was noted above that in native Amorite society, there were already kings and other titles that designated political functions or offices. So let me just stop there. When the Amorites come in there and they take over, they set up their own governmental political systems. Again, Hammurabi, his dynasty was Amorite. And they're going to use certain terms to describe themselves as rulers and their apparatus, their bureaucracy. Again, it's normal stuff. So ABD continues, following the diaspora of the Amorites in the 20th to 19th centuries BC, there was evidently a multitude of political titles that made use of the term Amuru, or the Sumerian Martu. The term father of the land of Amuru was used at Larsa, for example, by an Elamite king, and subsequently by other kings, including Hammurabi. The title became King of the Amorites by Hammurabi's 35th year and was a standard appellative of kings from then on, obviously devoid of any ethnic connotations. Now, that's an important paragraph. What it means is after the Amorites invade and they take over and they set up office, the title King of the Amorites is going to be used across the board in Mesopotamia and in the years following by anyone who's a king, whether they're ethnically an Amorite or not, because they sort of want to hitch their wagon to the conquerors. All right, it just becomes a title, King of the Amorites. Now, that becomes an issue when we get into biblical stuff. Back to ABD. The next and last occurrence of the royal title King of the Amorites occurs in the biblical references to Sihon, Sihon, who associated with Heshbon in Transjordan and who was defeated in the earliest recorded battle of the newly established Israelite Federation, Numbers 21. There can be little doubt of the historicity of the event, even though the present narratives are, of course, garbled by the overlay of later tradition and interpretation. His royal title must have derived from and represented a continuation of the political traditions of the old North Syrian principality of Amuru, the Amorites, together with a number of other puzzling traditions, notably the Balaam narratives. This title strongly indicates a considerable influx of population into Transjordan. Again, Transjordan is the other side of the Jordan, and into Palestine at the time when destructions in North Syria were leaving much of that region virtually depopulated. At the same time, in the transition from the late Bronze to the early Iron Age, the population of Transjordan saw a very sharp rise in density. And the only reasonable source for this rapid growth was the region to the north. Even the name Sihon, as well as Og of Bashan, who is also identified as an Amorite king, has no reasonable Semitic etymology. As was true also in Mesopotamia, the term Amorite no longer had any ethnic or linguistic significance and had simply become part of the traditional titulary of kings with North Syrian cultural connections. By the way, it's the foe from the north thing working its way through again. Again, if you've read Unseen Realm, you know what that is. The conclusion is inescapable that Sion and others were the remnants of North political entities. They were the Amorites that invaded Babylon long before had come from. And they were attempting to reestablish their old political regimes in another region, the Transjordan. So, again, what that means is the Amorites go into Babylon, they take over. They're so ubiquitous in terms of their rulership that the title King of Amorites, King of the Amorites, becomes something everybody uses everywhere. Now, when they, again, have trouble, when they get run out of town by the Mitanni, by the Hurrians, they eventually are going to go down into the Transjordan, where we find them biblically. Let's just say circa 1500 BC. Sion and Og. Okay, and Og again, clearly, these are Rephaim. They're clearly associated with giant clan stuff. Okay, they're going to come down into the Transjordan and they're going to call themselves Amorite kings. Doesn't mean they're Amorite ethnically descended, like if you gave them a DNA tag here and now. No, it means that they are trying to link their authority with the old Amorites with Babylon. Okay, it's Babylon again. This is why in Unseen Realm, I made a comment, a few comments on this in Unseen Realm, specifically about the way Og and his bed are described. Okay, if you remember this, again, if you've read the book, the sacred marriage bed of Marduk in Babylon aligns to the cubit, precisely with Og's bed, the dimensions that are given in Deuteronomy 3. Now, I'm going to read a little excerpt from Unseen Realm. The most immediate link back to the Babylonian polemic is Og's bed. In Hebrew, it's the Eres. Its dimensions, 9 by 4 cubits, are precisely those of the cultic bed in the ziggurat called Etemen Anki, which is the ziggurat most archaeologists identify as the Tower of Babel referred to in the Bible. Ziggurats function as temples and divine abodes. The unusually large bed at Etemen Anki was housed in the, quote, the house of the bed, the Beit Ershi, and Ershi and Eres, Hebrew, the word used for Og's bed. Those are cognate equivalents. It was the place where the god Marduk and his divine wife Zarpanitu met annually for ritual lovemaking, the purpose of which was divine blessing upon the land. Unquote. Then in a footnote I add this. Consequently, in addition to the giantism element, a link between Og and Marduk via the matching bed dimensions may also have telegraphed the idea that Og was the inheritor and perpetuator of the Babylonian knowledge and cosmic order from before the flood. Again, let me stop there. That's what Og wants you to think. That's why Og is calling himself an Amorite king. Okay, I'm from Babylon. I inherited the civilization. I'm a product of the wonderful Apkallu salvation that resulted in the greatness of Babylon. That's what Og wants you to think. And again, the biblical writers are clued into this. This is what the dimensions of Og's bed are about, not telling us how tall Og was precisely, but to link Og back to anti-Eden. And that's what the term Amorite is supposed to do. That's what the term Horite is supposed to do in these narratives, in these conquest narratives. Now, ABD continues that Sion and Og were not the only illustrations of such a process is indicated by the fact that the Amorites are also included in all of the various tables of the nations scattered through the Pentateuch and Joshua. These lists designate political regimes and not merely ethnic groups. This is evident both from the fact that they are labeled goyim, which is probably best defined as a politically organized military gang, just a group of people, maybe mercenaries, something like that. Again, a military force, a state force. They're labeled goyim, and from the fact that some of them, such as the Jebusites of Jerusalem, there's another name that we get associated with the conquest, okay? The Jebusites of Jerusalem can definitely be identified with specific city-states. It has been established that the regime of Jerusalem, already in the Amarna period, okay, this just call it 1300 BC, this is long before David. David has to take Jerusalem from the Jebusites, okay? It has long been established that the regime of Jerusalem, already in the Amarna period, derived from North Syria. It's where the Amorites are from. Its Amorite derivation is indicated not only by its name, Yabus, which is Amorite Yabusum, but also by the bitter condemnation of the prophet Ezekiel, Ezekiel 16:2-3, who accurately described Jerusalem's origin as a hybrid of Amorite and Hittite. Remember what the verses said? Ezekiel 16, Son of man, make known to Jerusalem her abominations, and say, thus says the Lord God to Jerusalem, your origin and your birth are of the land of the Canaanites. Your father was an Amorite and your mother a Hittite. And both those terms, Amorite, Hittite, are from the Amorite and the Mitannian invasions that will create what the biblical writers know as Babylon. Again, these things are not accident. And isn't that cool? When David, the prototype of the Messiah, chooses a capital, it's Jebus, the Amorite capital. Okay, it's like he's invading the new Babylon and taking it for Yahweh. Again, the conceptual imagery here, if you know the backloaded story and why these terms are used, why these place names, why these people group terms are used, it is all about the supernatural rebellions of Genesis 1-11. It's all about that, the anti-Eden, all of it. Again, what we do typically is we think that the context for understanding this stuff is just a map or pieces of pottery, or historical records of this or that, and all that's important. It is, but what you get typically with biblical scholars today is that they never even think about or introduce to you the cosmic religious angle of all of this stuff. That's what's missing. That's why the Old Testament can be pretty dry and toasty. This is the conflict between two kingdoms. I've used that phrase of Jesus' announcement about the kingdom of God. What is spiritual warfare? Spiritual warfare is actually the conflict between two kingdoms. And it's easy to see that when Jesus shows up and he starts saying things like, the kingdom of God is among you. And he starts casting out demons. Yeah, spiritual warfare. We finally get some of that. Look, you've been having that for a long time. You just don't recognize it because we don't know the terminology. We don't know the worldview in our heads. What Jesus is doing with Satan, casting out the demonic presence, okay, in various places, and he hits both Jewish and Gentile territory, okay? When he's doing this, he's doing what the Israelites were doing to the giant clans. I mean, it's the same thing. It's the conflict of two kingdoms. It's the effort to reinstall Eden and defeat the anti-Eden. It's order against chaos. It's Yahweh against the gods. It's Yahweh's children against their children. This is how it's perceived. But again, most of the time, Old Testament scholars, even in the evangelical tradition, they don't want to go there. It's just too weird. Well, okay, call it weird. It's weird. That's good. That's a nice word. But it's what's in the head of a biblical writer. Do you want to understand what they're writing or not? Here we go again. It's the same thing. I'll quote you a little bit from Peoples of the Old Testament World. This is a good book. I recommend it. I think it's available in paperback now. Numbers 13:29 states, quote, the Amalekites live in the land of the Negev, the Hittites, the Jebusites, the Amorites live in the hill country, and the Canaanites live by the sea and along the Jordan. While the Amorites are here listed among the peoples of the land, the Bible provides scant evidence about them. Yeah, specifically ethnically. The word Amorite, it continues, has ancient origins, deriving from the Akkadian Amuru, the equivalent of the earlier Sumerian Martu. In both languages, the word could designate a region, people, or direction, Westerner. And then it goes on to, again, talk about, the Amorites, but it says here, the discernment of specific ethnic groups from archaeological evidence is next to impossible. Excavations from Hazor in the north to Lachish in the south clearly indicate that throughout the region during the period of the Middle and Late Bronze Ages, the material culture was uniform. In the absence of inscriptional material, it's impossible to determine the relationship of particular material remains to a specific group. Nevertheless, Kathleen Kenyon begins with the biblical statement that the Amorites live in the hill country. Canaanites live by the sea along the Jordan, Numbers 13:29. And then, the rest of it is where these people live. Amorites are the hill dwellers, Canaanites are the plain dwellers, so on and so forth. I'm going to be as gentle as possible here. It doesn't matter, because Amorite transcends ethnicity. The term transcends ethnicity. And that's what you get with Horites, Horite, Hurrian. Horites maybe are also the Hivites. Okay? You're dealing with the use of a term to label a people an enemy who themselves, like Sion and Og, they wanted to be thought of as Amorites. They want you to think that they're the vestiges of what happened long ago in Babylon. Okay? It's supposed to make you think of that. It provides a cosmic theological rationale for what's happening on the ground in terms of the conquest in this area. And Yahweh has decided to settle, early before they even get to the land. Yahweh is here in this region. This is where his mountain is. And he's going to clean house. He doesn't want any agents of chaos, any, again, of these descendants from the days of the flood, the violation of the flood. He doesn't want them in his house, in his home, in his backyard, in his front yard. He doesn't want them. So he's going to remove them in preparation for the company that he does want. That would be his people who he has taken out of Egypt. And then when they're there, he's going to give them the law, and then he's going to travel with them to Canaan. And we're going to have to repeat the process where we go. We're going to go to the Transjordan and finish the job there, because we still have some of these Amorite dudes left. The Rephaim are still up there in Bashan. So we're going to take care of business there. Descendants of Esau have already taken care of business in Ammon and Moab. Okay? We're going to take care of business in Bashan, and then we're going to cross into the land. And these are the targets. The people, those individuals that are perceived as being descended from the episode of the flood. This is where you get, again, the whole failure, Numbers 13, again, like I talk about an unseen realm, it's not a coincidence that where the verbs of killing, the cherem terminology and other verbs are used. If you go to the places where they're used, they all happen to be places where the Anakim were spotted. Again, it's not a coincidence. It's a cosmic theological rationale for what is going on and what God wants done. There are other verbs of conquest used. Again, I point this out in Unseen Realm that talk about dispossess, drive out, expel. It's not just verbs of killing. Again, it's the verbs of killing show up when you have armed conflict in places where the vestiges of the giant clans are. You just do. And again, I'm not saying that other people aren't killed. And these particular individuals are scattered throughout the land. They're pockets of them. They just they live in different places among the other peoples of the land. Okay, but they're the ones that get targeted, and God has been targeting them long for centuries before Israel ever shows up. And this is the overarching rationale for what's going on here. Now let's take this back to again, just spend a few minutes here in Exodus. So I told you it was going to be like a long rabbit trail to set this up. So Exodus 17, 8 through 16, the battle with the Amalekites. Again, we know where this place is. It's part of this regional complex of where Yahweh is, and Sinai and the mountain and all this sort of stuff. So we know, kind of the context here for what's going on. And let's just read a couple of the, there are a few things here that are kind of curious when we actually get into it. Amalek came and fought with Israel at Refidim. So Moses said to Joshua, choose for us men, go out and fight with Amalek. Tomorrow I will stand on the top of the hill with the staff of God in my hand. And that's an important phrase. He's going to stand on the hill with the staff of God in his hand. So Joshua did as Moses told him and fought with Amalek, while Moses, Aaron, and Hur went to the top of the hill. Whenever Moses held up his hand, Israel prevailed. Whenever he lowered his hand, Amalek prevailed. And then in verses 12 and following, they give him a place to sit. They hold up his hands on either side. And when the hands are up, Israel prevails. When they're down, Amalek prevails. So, what's going on here? Well, in episode 280, the one on Elim's 12 springs and 70 palm trees, the latter, the end of Exodus 15, we talked a little bit about this. The rod is conceptually connected to the tree metaphor of divine presence. Okay, where did he get the rod? Burning bush. Okay, God specifically, empowers Moses through the rod. Take your rod that's in your hand, put it down, and all these things that Moses is going to now use the rod to work for signs. It represents the power of God and the presence of God because of where it came from and because God is with Moses. It also goes back even further, as we talked in episode 280. Again, you got to think like an ancient person, but where do rods come from? They come from trees. They're made of wood. Why are trees important? Because they mark places of divine encounter. This is all over the Old Testament. Okay? They mark, especially, the Torah, they mark places of divine encounter. And the big one, of course, is Eden. It sets kind of a different tone because here we have Moses with the rod of God in his hand, which again serves as a cosmic metaphor for the presence and power of God. And where was the presence and power of God first known on earth? Well, that would be Eden. Okay, the garden. Gardens have trees. Okay, again, all of these things are interrelated. The set of ideas, a matrix of ideas here. So you have, again, it's cosmic geography. It's holy war in that sense. God is going to deal with Amalek, who is descended from the Horites, in this place with the tree, okay, with the rod. Okay. Again, conceptually, the elements just come together, and it just gives you a little bit of a different flavoring for what's going on in the confrontation. The battle, you have the rod of God used. You get to verse 11, the part about holding up the hands. Commentators will say, well, the meaning of the holding up the hands is unclear. Maybe it's like laying on a hand. No, he has the rod in his hands. That's what the earlier verse said. He's not going to stand up there with empty hands and raise the hands and look. No, I'm going to stand at the top of the hill with the rod of God in my hand. That's what the hands are. The motion is about raising the rod. And that language, interestingly enough, if we actually look up the lemma used here for held up, okay, that also occurs, the same verb about holding up the staff of God and holding up the hands. It occurs in Exodus 7:20. Moses and Aaron did as the Lord commanded. In the sight of Pharaoh and in the sight of his servants, he lifted up the staff and struck the water in the Nile. And all the water in the Nile turned into blood. It shows up in Exodus 14:16. Lift up your staff, stretch out your hand over the sea, and divide it, that the people of Israel may go through the sea on dry ground. To me, it's very clear, that what's going on here. He is wielding the rod of God. Moses is empowered by the rod, the staff. And why is it important that it be held up? So that the people can see who is delivering them, who is giving them victory. You hold it up at the top of the hill. If you're not holding it up, they don't know that it's there. They don't know that Yahweh is fighting on their behalf. Again, the victory is linked to the rod. It's not Moses. It's not Joshua's generalship. It's the rod of God. It's the staff, and it's seen when you hold it up. When you hold it up high. That's the whole point of the description of the story. Now, verses 15 and 16 to wrap up, they're kind of enigmatic. Moses built an altar and called the name of it, "The Lord is my banner," saying, "A hand upon the throne of the Lord. The Lord will have war with Amalek from generation to generation." Now, that's the ESV. Sarna says, although the passage purports to be an explanation of the altar's name, the relationship between the two, between the altar and the saying, are difficult to discern. Well, they are. Currid, in his commentary, writes this, and I think this is you'll see what I think here in a minute. Currid writes, the Hebrew term often translated banner is really standard or signal pole. The Hebrew word is nes, N-E-S. Okay. In antiquity, a standard was a rallying point. Often it bore an emblem, symbol, or banner on its top. A standard was normally raised on a hill or other high place to be seen by all. It was an object of focus and hope for the people. And so Moses' appearance on the top of the hill with the rod of God in his hand acted much like a standard. The rod on the hill served as a symbol of Yahweh's power. Yahweh was thus seen to be the standard beneath which Israel rallied. Now, we know that the word banner is nes. Okay, so let me go back to the two verses again. Here, it sounds kind of odd. Okay, Moses built an altar and called the name of it, "The Lord is my banner." The Lord is my nes. Okay, nesi actually in Hebrew. Saying, Moses is like interpreting the name of the altar. A hand upon the throne of the Lord. What's that? What throne? What are we talking about here? Now, a lot of commentators have pointed out that the word throne here is case, kaf, instead of nun. Spelled, the consonants between nes and case are the same except the first one. And so some have thought, well, maybe this is a script error. It's true that Old Hebrew, Paleo Hebrew letters K and N are very similar. And so when the Hebrew Bible was moved or transcribed, either from Old Hebrew or when the script being used was transitioning from the Old Hebrew script to the block script that we're familiar with today, they could have confused the K and the N. And so maybe we're supposed to read banner in both of these verses. The Lord is my banner, saying, "A hand upon the banner of the Lord." That would make sense in view of Moses holding up the rod and stuff like that. So most commentators are going to say, look, this is a text critical problem. It should read "a hand upon the banner of the Lord," not "a hand upon the throne of the Lord," which really doesn't make any sense. And the point would be, if we make that textual change, the point of calling the altar "the Lord is my banner," it would be Yahweh is my power. Yahweh fights for me. And then the following verse, changing throne to banner, would be to explain how the Lord fought. Well, he wielded his rod against his enemies. The altar would mark the ground as under Yahweh's dominion. So it kind of works, it kind of fits. And to me, that's a good explanation. However, the Masoretic text as it stands could be kept. You don't have to make the change. You can still sort of get the same basic point. Instead of "a hand upon the throne of Yahweh," you could translate the verse "a hand against the throne of Yahweh." And what would the point there be if we just go with the word throne, hand against? Well, the reading as it stands would explain not how the Lord fought, because it doesn't have the word banner in it anymore. It has the word throne. It would instead explain why the Lord fought. The Amalekites had encroached on his domain, his sovereignty, there at Refidim, which again is in the region of all these other places associated with the presence of God in Sinai. So the Amalekites are trespassers, and they're also threatening God's people. So if Moses builds the altar and calls the name of it, "The Lord is my banner," saying there was a hand against the throne of Yahweh here, and the Lord will have war with Amalek from generation to generation because of that. Anti-Eden is encroaching upon Eden. That would be the point. So whichever one you prefer, again, I think you can make a good, very interesting theological, cosmic theological statement out of it. So that's the latter half of Exodus 17. Again, I told you up front it's going to sound like a long rabbit trail, but I think it's useful to do this from time to time because there's just a lot going on under the surface if you think like an Israelite. Again, a literate Israelite who knows the set of ideas, who knows the little bit of the history of the other people, and the scribes. I mean, these are literate people writing the Hebrew Bible for their own audience, and they're assuming certain points of knowledge about peoples and about terms and about places in their own lives, in their own histories, whether they be oral histories or some other parts of the Bible that happen to be written before this, whatever, that we just lack. We just lack exposure to that sort of thing. So I think it's useful to go on rabbit trails like this occasionally because they become helpful for kind of fleshing out things that are going on in a particular passage.